Okay, so one of the students told me that it helps for me to be in front of you when I lecture. So I'm going to try this new thing where I do that. If you like it, great. Let me know. If you don't, then let me know that too, so that I know whether or not this is a good idea. I'm hoping it is, but I'm not positive. So, yeah, just give me an idea so I kind of know whether this is better or worse. Okay, so the lymphatic system. This is going to be the first system in Unit 2 for your lab. The lymphatic system is a system that does kind of three major things. One, it helps collect excess fluid out of your tissues. So something that is a kind of a design flaw in our cardiovascular system is that our places where exchange happens, the capillaries, they actually leak. So we end up with excess fluid in our tissues. Now, this becomes a problem because if you leave it there, you end up with a hypotonic solution and it'll cause your cells to rupture. So we have this other system that kind of helps to pick up all this excess fluid. Second thing that can go wrong there, when you pick up the excess fluid, it's going to be very, very dirty because it's been sitting with all of these living cells that just kind of throw waste out into space around them. So you pick this up, you can't just dump it back into cardiovascular system because it's dirty. So you've got pit stops along the way that kind of filter and filter and filter, and this fluid, lymph, gets filtered multiple times so that by the time that it does get back to the cardiovascular system, it's been filtered multiple times and it's not as dirty. So that's one job. Second job, we talk about the immune system in the lymphatic system. The immune system is going to be the part of our immunity that actually recognizes targets and goes after specific targets, and then remembers those targets for long term. The third thing that this does is it allows us to absorb fats from our digestive system. So fats are kind of complex in the fact that you can't just put fat in the watery environment of the blood and expect it to go well. It doesn't work that way because the fat itself doesn't like water. So we kind of touched on this before. We have to put them in a transport protein. So you go from something this big to something that big. Now, the problem with that is that when you do that, you end up with these huge things. Most capillaries have teeny tiny microscopic pinholes to try and get things in. And things that are molecular in size, like glucose or amino acids, are pretty easy to get in, as well as the fact that they are water soluble, so they don't mind the watery environment of the blood. With fats, they can't do that. So instead of having these teeny tiny pinholes that things can get into and out of, they have trapdoors that actually open and close. So these big trapdoors are big enough that these things that are big can actually fit and get in there, these wrapped lipids. So we've got all of those functions that are happening in our lymphatic system. So let's talk about the parts and the pieces. So this is the lymphatic system as far as big overview. You've got the tonsils up in the oral area. Remember I talked about the immunity? Think about how many things you put in your mouth, and they're all out here before you put them in your mouth. Having some immune tissues there is not a bad idea. We've got the thymus. The thymus is actually responsible for creating one of our immune cells. It is above your heart, but behind your sternum. We've got the spleen. The spleen sits on the posterior abdominal wall of the left side. And the spleen is actually responsible for filtering your blood of dead and dying red blood cells. Remember that red blood cells have a finite lifespan. They don't live forever. So eventually they kind of start to break down. The spleen is one of the organs that's responsible for filtering the blood, and whenever a red blood cell isn't doing so well, it gets caught there so that macrophages can do the whole recycling thing and recycle the hemoglobin. The lacteals in the intestinal wall. I talked about absorbing fats. This is going to be where we're absorbing fats from. Now, you can probably see all of these pinto beans with the green vessels near them. These are going to be your lymphatic vessels. Those are going to be the tubes. And then these little dudes here that look like green pinto beans are going to be your lymph nodes. Remember I said that we pick up fluid. We pick up fluid and we filter it and then we drop it off. Well, these vessels are the ones picking up the fluid. But as they pick up this fluid, let's say we're picking it up from the hand, as they pick up this fluid, there are pit stops of lymph nodes all the way to where they're going to drop it back off in the cardiovascular system. So these lymph nodes are actually our filters. So not only does it get filtered here at about the elbow, it gets filtered up here toward the armpit, it gets filtered up here toward the shoulder, it gets filtered all the way until we get to the cardiovascular system. So we've got the right lymphatic duct. Now remember, right and left is as if it is your right and left. So this would be the right, this would be the left. It wouldn't be right and left this way like you're facing. You're the patient. So you've got the right lymphatic duct. Remember, duct is just a fancy way of saying tube that dumps the lymph back into general circulation. You've got the thymus. Now, the axillary lymph node. The axillary lymph node. Axillary means armpit. So the axillary lymph node is going to be in the armpit. You've got the mammary plexus. Mammillary? I don't know where that came from. The mammary plexus. You can see that you've got a whole bunch of these vessels there for absorbing excess fluid. Again, any of these lines that you see are just going to be lymphatic vessels transporting lymph. Now, inside of the bone, you've got bone marrow, of course, specifically in the ends of your femur, in the pelvis. Where was I? This side. The cervical lymph node. It's going to be right next to the cervical vertebra in the neck. You've got the thoracic duct. Again, that's kind of a dumping tube after having the filtering going on. You've got the thoracic duct. Here's your thorax where your heart and your lungs are, so that makes sense. You've got lacteals, like I said, in the intestinal wall. And then down here in your hip, you've got the inguinal lymph nodes. Now, inguinal means basically your upper leg, your hip area. So that makes sense. So, a little bit more detail. But again, you've got that thoracic duct, the left jugular duct. The thoracic duct is this guy. The left jugular duct, the left subclavian, the left bronchomediastinal. Remember, the mediastinum is the cavity that holds your heart and your thymus and part of your esophagus and part of your trachea. It's kind of dead center in the middle. So that makes sense. The right jugular trunk, the right subclavian, the right bronchomediastinal. So you've got left, again, patient's left, patient's right. You've got the right lumbar trunk, the left lumbar trunk, the intestinal trunk, and then there's that thoracic. Again, where your heart and your lungs are, that's the thoracic cavity, so that makes sense. All right, taking a real up-close look. Right jugular trunk, right subclavian, right bronchomediastinal. There's that thoracic duct. Left jugular, left subclavian, left bronchomediastinal. And you can see that there are differences between the left and the right, but you kind of still have that same primary. Now looking at the model, Lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes, right? Now, where is it? It's in the thigh, it's in the hip. So these are going to be the inguinal lymph nodes because they're in the hip. These are just lymphatic vessels. I don't care where they are, they're just lymphatic vessels. Go with lymphatic vessels because that makes it simpler. Now, armpit, axillary, right? So up close, here are the axillary lymph nodes, and again, the lymphatic vessels. Don't need to get more complicated than that. Here's the thymus. Like I said, it's above the heart, but it's behind the sternum. So you can see the heart, you can see the trachea, you can see lymph nodes surrounding it. This is actually the thymus. So looking at the histology of the thymus, I mentioned before that medulla and cortex always mean the same thing. Medulla means middle, cortex means outside, right? So if you look here, you'll notice that I've got kind of a lighter inside and a darker outside, right? So I've got the thymic medulla and the thymic cortex. Inside of the thymic medulla, we have these structures, thymic corpuscles. Honestly, we don't know what they do. We have no clue. But we do know that when you visually look at them, they look completely unique. So we point them out because it's a unique structure. Now remember, these slides are coming from this organ. This is the organ that actually does the maturation of our T cells for our immune system. Now, the spleen, the tonsil, and the lymph node. Thing with the spleen, the tonsil, and the lymph node is they all look very, very similar. They all kind of have these circular structures in them, but there are things that are unique when you look at the histology slides. There are things that don't appear in other slides. So for example, if you look at the lymph node, do you see all of this gamish out here? That is not there and it isn't there. So if you see something that has all of this connective tissue on the outside, it's automatically going to be lymph node. If you look here, this is the tonsil. This circle looks pretty smooth all the way throughout, right? But if you look here, even though it's smooth, there's an artery inside of the spleen that is not located in the tonsil. So landmark-wise, you've got an artery, you've got connective tissue, and you've got nothing for either. So if you're learning these for your practical, it's a good idea to actually look at those landmarks. First, look at them side by side and see what you recognize, and make sure that you understand what's different about each one. Then when you look at them individually, it's a lot easier to actually see that, to observe that. So this is your spleen. As I said, it's in the posterior abdominal cavity of the left side. Now, where it actually sits here, you actually have organs kind of up against the sides. So we've got a specific, surface based on what's touching it. So here, this is the gastric surface. In AMP, if you see the word gastric, it means stomach. So the stomach, the curve of the stomach is actually touching the spleen there. Back here, along the back rim, it says renal surface. Renal is the kidney. If you hear renal, it means kidney. You'll hear it when we get to the urinary system like crazy. Renal artery, renal vein, renal blah, blah, blah. But that surface is actually up against the kidney, which is why we call it the renal surface. You've got the splenic artery and the splenic vein, and then the hilum is where everything is going in. It's the indentation. So if I've got arteries and veins coming in right here, do you see that little indent right there? That would be the hilum. So that's what you have when it comes to the spleen. Now, if you look here, this is the spleen in the model. Now I'm going to go up a bit closer. See this brown thing? This is the kidney. That's why there's the renal surface, because it is actually touching the kidney. Kind of looks like a gray speckle, a gray speckly comma. That's the spleen. And like I said, it's in the posterior of your abdominal cavity. Looking at the slide or the histology for the spleen, you've got these things here, these circles. See that circle right there? Anything that is lymphatic tissue is going to have this little bundle. It's actually a sphere of cells, and it's called a lymphatic nodule. Anything that is lymphatic tissue has a lymphatic nodule. So that circle that you see is the lymphatic nodule. Now remember the artery I pointed out earlier? This is the central artery. Now, dead center in the middle of this circle is going to be the germinal center. Now, germinate means to make more. So this is one of the places where we make more cells. Okay? So that's the spleen. Tonsils. We actually have 3 sets of tonsils. We've got the pharyngeal tonsils, we've got the palatine tonsils, and we've got the lingual tonsil. Palatine are the ones that when you're sick and you don't feel good and you go, my throat hurts, look at my throat. That's the one that we're actually looking at, okay? The pharyngeal, which is up here, people will often refer to them as adenoids, okay? And then the lingual is actually on the back of the tongue. Now, if you still have your tonsils, that's where they're located. And like I said, having immune tissue in that area is kind of important, because when we eat, we take stuff from out here and put it in our body. So having that extra immune tissue there is actually a good idea. So why do people get their tonsils out? Well, people tend to get their tonsils out when they keep getting infection after infection and they keep swelling, and it's not really helping the way that it should. And when it doesn't help the way that it should, then they take them out, because instead of being beneficial, they're more a hindrance. So this is in your mouth, right? This is oral. So you've got the oral mucosa. This is that top layer that is inside of your mouth. Now remember, one of the membranes that we have is a mucosal layer. Anything that comes into contact with the outside world has that mucosal lining, mucosal. So you've got the oral mucosa. Again, you can see that circle. So that is going to be the lymphatic nodule. And again, dead center, you've got the same thing, the germinal center, where you're going to make more cells. The lymph nodes. We just discussed those lymph nodes a minute ago. Looking at it up close, this is what a lymph node looks like. So you've got this pinto bean. You'll notice that I've got those same circles all along the outside. Okay? Now, don't forget, middle means medulla, or medulla means middle, cortex means outside, right? So this area here in the middle is the medulla. You've got the medullary cords and the medullary sinus. The cords are going to be the solid pieces. The sinuses are going to be the hollow spaces. Remember I told you that we're filtering the lymph as it comes in, and these are my filters? This bundle of cells and the cords and reticular fibers and things like that actually become equivalent to a coffee filter. Out here in the cortex, okay, so the outside is the cortex, we have the subcapsular sinus, which is going to be the capsule that goes around. Right underneath that, you've got the diffuse lymphatic tissue, which is out here. The cortical sinus, again, that's going to be the sinus in the cortex, as opposed to under the capsule. The nodule, the lymphatic nodule, the germinal center, same as it was before. You basically have entrances and exits. So I'm taking fluid and I'm putting it into this. Once it percolates through everything, then it goes out the other end. So I have afferent lymphatic vessels coming in. Think afferent arrival, okay? And then I've got one efferent lymphatic vessel. So as this is coming in and it's percolating through, that filtration system that I've been talking about catches things that shouldn't basically go the rest of the way. And I've got macrophages in here that eat whatever isn't supposed to be there. And what comes out has been filtered to get it out of the lymph node and filtered so that when I dump it back into general circulation, it isn't dirty anymore. So here's my lymph node slide. Again, see all this out here? Lymph nodes are out in the body. They're not kind of isolated, so they have to have a lot of connective tissue around it. Not to mention they have to have a capsule. So if you look here, see that thick band of pink? You can see it up here as it comes down. That's the capsule. These are my circles that I've been talking about this entire time. That's the lymphatic nodule. Again, if you're lymphatic tissue, you're going to have these. The cortex is where you're going to see these circles. When you don't see them anymore, you're in the medulla. When you're in the cortex, you see the circles, you see the lymphatic nodules. When you get to the medulla, there aren't any. Same thing, okay? And don't worry about those because I moved them. I very intentionally moved them in the presentation. And I will post the new updated presentation for you. Let me know if this worked better. I don't know if this works better or not. I don't know if you prefer seeing just the slide or you prefer me pointing things out and moving my hands while I talk. Let me know.